Buddhist doctrine is saying that our universe is so interconnected in all its parts that one part of it, so-called, can exist only in relation to all the others. All motion, too, is in relation to all other motion. So that there is, it works, as we would say in physical theory, as a field of forces. There is no separate center in which any motion or activity originates. All activity that occurs at any spot, as it were, originates over the whole system. And this is another meaning of the Taoist idea of Wu Wei. You remember this term, Wu, not Wei, acting or striving. The deeper meaning of this idea is that nothing acts of itself. There is, as it were, no such thing as an agent. For action is the nature of the whole thing, and it, as it were, appears in one place in relation to stillness in another, and so on. Now, when you have a highly relative system of this nature, if you want to introduce into it some kind of order, as we want to introduce order into society, we can't base a social order on a completely relative conception of the world. Because in order to have cosmos instead of chaos, you've got to have some standards. But since these standards don't exactly exist in the universe, we invent them. And therefore our social life depends, as it were, on practicing certain deceptions. The Western philosopher Weihinger invented the term, the philosophy of as if. And all social order and communication depends upon certain deceptions being practiced. And I would say these deceptions are as follows. The first deception is that there are things. That is to say, that these vortices or nexuses in the total pattern of the universe are real and separate from each other and can be treated as such. In other words, to describe, to talk about the world, we have to break it down into various different units. Just in the same way, if you're going to eat a chicken, you have to chop it up in sections, and it's easier to eat that way. But the cut-up fryer doesn't come out of the egg. It isn't found in nature. Nor do you find eggs where there are no chickens. Nor do you find chickens where there is no environment suitable to them, and so on. So the pretense that things are separable from each other is necessary in order to think and talk about them. The next thing we have to pretend is that there are agents. That, in other words, the human individual is a separate thing, originating action and responsible for it. But in this conception of the completely relative universe, action does not originate at any particular spot. It's a property of the whole field, as it were, focusing action at these spots. But for purposes of social intercourse, we have to pretend that we are individual agents from whom action comes. And this pretense is enhanced by the third thing, the rewards and punishments. Now, this is terribly important. The reward for regarding oneself as a responsible agent and acting accordingly is the promise of something good coming in the future, whether it be in this life or whether it be in some other life. So that we are constantly attracted and kept at this game based on these three deceptions by living for a good thing coming in the future. And this, as it were, conceals from us what our own proverb tells us in saying, tomorrow never comes. We are only really ever alive now. And we get distracted from living fully now by having our eye on the future. Now, of course, there is a reasonable advantage in planning for the future. But a person who is, as it were, hypnotized by the future and unable to be awake now really has no use in planning for the future, because when his plans develop, he won't really be able to enjoy them. Punishments are not only the punishments that parents and teachers mete out to recalcitrant children, but we begin to get the feeling that, for example, things like disease or accidents are punishments, and that death too is a punishment. And as if that weren't sufficient, societies have always invented a complicated system of post-mortem retribution, various heavens and hell, whether they are permanent or impermanent, in which the rewards and punishments are further extended. Now, this system of deceptions, we could say creative deceptions, I don't want the word deception to have a bad flavor, is inculcated into us in childhood in every culture in the world. And it leaves a permanent mark on us. The mark being that we come to believe that these three things are real. Having accomplished the job of creating a social discipline and of getting human beings to step the right paces, to dance, as it were, to the tune played by the piper. Having done that, they are burned into us. And so we come to feel that we really are separate things, that we are agents and sources of action, that we are actually responsible for what we do, that there is that ego thing inside us, which is the initiator, the doer, the will behind all action. And so we also come to believe in these various rewards and punishments, whether it be the Christian system of heaven and hell, or whether it be the Hindu-Buddhist system of transmigration or reincarnation, living life after life after life, inheriting in each following life the karma or destiny which we prepared for ourselves in the preceding one. And this is very convenient, because then there is no, as it were, way of escaping the police. There are celestial police as well as terrestrial police, and by this we are kept in order. But you see, this stratagem of these social deceptions is really like a raft that we use to cross a river. When we have, in young people, inculcated the order, to go on being taken in by these deceptions is like picking up the raft when you've crossed to the opposite bank and carrying it with you, and it becomes a burden. And so what Zen is basically is a way of freeing human beings from those deceptions, returning them to the vision of the world in its complete relativity. Now, the training which one goes through with a Zen teacher, shall we say, lifts these deceptions off one's mind. Now, you might say, I can understand intellectually, I can understand the idea that I only seem to be an agent, a source of action, and that things only seem to be separate from each other, but are actually interconnected. But does this make me feel any different inside? And you might say, well, no, I don't think it really does. To understand it fully, I would like to change the way I feel. But here comes the crucial point in the understanding of Zen. On the one hand, if you set out to change the way you feel, that might be called a discipline. On the other hand, if you decide simply to accept the way you feel and not try to change your inner feelings at all, that might be called letting things alone. But here's the point. If you have understood clearly that you as a separate will or a separate ego are a fiction, then on the one hand, you can't change it, and on the other hand, you can't do nothing about it. because there is no agent, no separate doer, either to do something about it or to do nothing about it. And so this situation seems, as it were, paralyzing. If you can't do, and if you can't don't, what's going to happen? But the point of this is that that paralysis is a realization of the unreality of the individual agent. So what happens? From this point, one ceases to take oneself seriously. Now, of course, there is always a danger in not taking the things seriously which society says we should take seriously. There's the case of, you know, the raw youth, the sort of juvenile delinquent type who's in revolt against society and would use the experiences and ideas of Buddhism to justify that revolution. And that is why the practice in Asia is to reveal this point of view only to those who are socially mature. And so the discipline of the Zen school is a safeguard for the dangerous understanding or the dangerous insight which is there being hatched. And so all those rigorous tests which I explain, the rigorous regimen of life, these, as it were, do not directly produce the understanding, but they are, as it were, the guarded stockade around it. For Zen, you see, is fundamentally an insight. The recognition, in other words, of the deception, the as-ifness of these fundamental assumptions about the world which are necessary to social life. But then, when you don't take them seriously anymore, when you don't take your own separate existence seriously anymore, then you have, as it were, been inwardly relieved of the burden of this feeling of responsibility which society inculcates.